We'll be fine.
Yes, there we
I think
go.
it's actually recording now.
All right. Welcome, guys. Eden's Living TV here. We're going to make sure, is it recording on your end, Dr. Ramdhan? Is it showing recording?
It is recording, yeah.
All right, good deal.
Yep.
We're going to take two then. Eden's Living here, Susan Pierce. We're going to be talking about post-traumatic stress, triggering the perfect storm. And Dr. Radley is an expert. He actually served in our military. Thank you, sir. You were in Kuwait and Iraq, I believe, in 2016, 2017. You have a Bachelor of Science in Biology, your master's in acupuncture. We're going to be doing an acupuncture podcast after this. I'm excited about, but welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me, and it's good to be back. So today's topic is
I'll just say I'm
PTSD,
so happy to have you back. Just so happy.
So today's topic is PTSD, and it's something that I have a passion for through my service with the military. I did my thesis on PTSD as well, and I've had a couple of PTSD patients while in school and even after I graduated. So it's something near and dear sort of to my heart.
Yes, and you know,
so I'm looking forward to
and it really helps. Yeah, we talk. I'm getting a little bit of echo, so let me know if it's lagging a little bit. But we were talking before we started recording about how when you really do have post-traumatic stress, sometimes finding a safe place or a counselor that understands what's going on, because post-traumatic stress can really mimic mental illness when in essence it's unprocessed trauma. So could you kind of address that, since a lot of people think, oh man, she's crazy, that she's really mentally unstable?
So in terms of the first point you made in terms of like finding somebody that works best with you, I think that is important. There's a lot of great counselors out there, and everybody has their own sort of niche in terms of their specialty and how they approach dealing with PTSD. So as an individual, you have certain things that you like, certain ways that makes it easier for you to get things out, easier for you to process things. So some people like talking, some people like writing, some people like creative arts. So you have to kind of figure out where you're at, and you find somebody who sort of would mesh with your style in terms of allowing you to process it. So it's a bit of a challenge sometimes. Sometimes you have to go and you have to see multiple healthcare providers in order to get the most effective help. And nothing's wrong with that. Don't ever feel bad that if you have to do that. And as a practitioner, don't ever feel bad if your patient has to switch, because sometimes it's just that you don't mesh enough to actually sort of allow that space for that patient to open up. They may open up on some things, but they may not necessarily feel comfortable opening up with everything. Or it just might be the approach that you use that makes sort of the difference in how much they open up.
It really is a comfort thing, because when I tried to find someone, I actually got help with initial trauma response. It's called ITR therapy, and they really saved my life. That whole dynamic is telling the story, doing word association, and going back and allowing your brain to process that that was an event, that you're safe, and that your brain kind of lets go of it. So let's talk about, we're going to talk about triggering the perfect storm here. Let's go and do the slideshow here to the next page. And I really want to go into some steps to maybe kind of identify if you do have post-traumatic stress, and just let you teach. I'm going to hand over the mic to you, and you just teach us, Doc.
Okay, thank you. So on to the next slide.
All right. Well, it is not letting me. It is frozen. Love Live podcast. It's not letting me. Hang on. Let's close some stuff out. Maybe to go. There. Oh, there it goes. Let's go back. All right, here we go. Let's talk about trauma after trauma and the perfect storm.
So everybody that knows 2020, it's been a rough year for everybody, one way or the other. And it started from the beginning of the year, and we have a couple weeks left, and we don't know what those couple weeks left holds for us. But there's been a lot of things from the COVID-19, the global health pandemic, lockdowns and stay-at-home orders has been an extra stressor on everybody. The idea of having to wear masks for some people is an extra stressor just because it feels restricted. Financial crisis in terms of people losing their jobs, having to stay at home and not necessarily knowing where their next paycheck comes from. We've had a lot of riots and protests in terms of social injustice, inequality, racism. There's a lot of global conflict that has been sort of aggravating in 2020, and even personal conflicts with just individuals at their homes. Even with the lockdowns, domestic violence has been increasing. Domestic abuse has been increasing just because of that extra restriction, where people are now in the situation where they're uncomfortable at a degree, and it's not something that they used to. So everything's sort of in a boiling pot, and it's actually ready to overflow. And that's what is actually creating the perfect storm. In addition to that, we've had a couple hurricanes, we've had fires and stuff like that. Has been all across the country, all around the world. So there's a lot of natural and man-made disasters that we're seeing currently. So that kind of creates the perfect storm for PTSD in 2020, because some people are re-experiencing some things. Some of these stay-at-home stuff, some of the unemployment are bringing up past traumas that people are now boiling over, and they are having that re-experience and flashback type things. So we could move on to the next slide.
All right.
So moving on to the types of traumas, it's basically three general types of traumas that you class it: an acute trauma, chronic trauma, or complex trauma. Acute just means like a single incident. A chronic trauma would be something that has been repeated and it's a prolonged thing. And then complex would be varied traumas with multiple different types of traumatic events. So an acute would be one aspect of where, all right, I saw a car accident and it was traumatic. So that would be sort of an acute. It was just one time, it was over and it was done with. The chronic one would be, you could consider that something more of like an abuse case. You would see it where it's like the person's abused over and over and over and over. And that becomes sort of that chronic aspect of it. Complex would be somebody who's had childhood traumas, then they grew up, they started noticing, say, for example, car accidents, or they have a job that exposes them to more traumatic events. So sometimes even psychologists or in the health aspect itself, just seeing trauma within patients, it could actually bring back up aspects for you. So complex would be something that, or even military, where it's like you go deployment, you've had a past history of whatever trauma it is, and now you're building on different types of traumas. So we could go on to the next slide.
Yeah, just a little input here about complex post-traumatic stress. I didn't realize, since I had some childhood events, and then I had my car wreck and some other things that happened in my adult. I had, some jobs I lost due to health. I had no idea of the multi-layering of trauma really drives that post-traumatic stress, and complex has so many varied health issues that are really tied into that. I'd like for you to maybe just touch on that. If you do have complex post-traumatic stress, how it affects your health and trusting people too.
So with complex trauma, I think of it sort of like a layer of onion. Every trauma becomes a layer in that onion. And when you have to work with somebody who's been through that complex aspect of it, a lot of it is peeling away layers. And you have to deal with it as it comes up. So sometimes it's something very simple. It's the most core traumatic event that person sort of stored in their memory, that this was the one big thing. Even though it might be something very simple as somebody yelling at them as a kid, in their mind, they stored that as a traumatic event. And then as they grew older, it built on different types of trauma. So say you're born in 1956, right? And you experience your first traumatic event in 1957. You stored that first memory. And then 1970 was your next actual big traumatic event. So when you were 1 year old, your parent dropped you or something, right? I'm just using something random. And then in 1970, you're a little bit older, and then you encounter a car accident. And then 2000, you have another accident. And then 2020 comes up, and you have all of these things that explode in altogether, right? When you have to deal with something like that, the core one would actually be sort of that first one that you recognize. The first one that you stored in your brain, that would be the biggest one that you'd have to deal with. But to get there, because there's been other traumas that is built on it, sometimes you neglect it, because to you, that small fall that you had as a kid doesn't compare as much as those bigger traumas. Seeing the car accident, being in 2020 and having to go through all of these different things, they don't seem as big. So in the back of your mind, it's there, but you don't have that to the forefront when you go to ask for help, to say, you know what, I think I have PTSD and let me deal with these traumas. So the healthcare provider would ask you a question on your traumatic event. And in your mind, you'd be like, well, this is small compared to everything else. I'm not going to talk about it. And a lot of times with complex PTSD, you have to tear each layer apart individually. So they might think the 1970 event was the biggest one. So that would be the first one that they would clear out. And then 2000's event, and then 2020. And then when they're done with all of that, then they still feel like things haven't resolved. And then you dig in a little deeper, and then you find out the first event when they were 1 year old was the biggest core event within all those complex traumas that has happened to them. That's the biggest one that sort of stems everything else beyond. So it's sort of like the first one's your foundation when it comes to trauma. You break that foundation, the entire building of PTSD sort of collapses. It allows you to be able to move on and to easily let go of things rather than holding on to it. So I'll use that analogy of thinking of the first one sort of as a magnet, and then every negative event that happens sort of adds and sucks into that one magnet. And then the magnet now is covered by all of these metal objects. But to get to that magnet, you can't just pull one out and get to it. You have to peel layers off of that magnet. So it's the same thing, onion, magnet, same sort of comparison. But the idea is peeling them off one at a time and again, it goes back to finding somebody that helps you do that. So you may end up in a case where you have to go to 5 different counselors, 5 different healthcare providers to get that same benefit. Or you might be lucky that you get to one that helps you get through all 5. So again, personality fit, which one falls where, and how does that healthcare provider sort of assess you? How does that healthcare provider work with you? And then how do you get each layer off?
That is a great analogy of the forks and the magnet. That's great. To get to the magnet itself, you really do have to take all the individual traumas. And with that layering, there's just, there's bitterness, and there's anger, and then there's trust issues, and there's health issues. And it's then the brain inflammation. There's so many components to post-traumatic stress. So let's talk about some of these transgenerational and transgenerational traumas.
So basically, transgenerational trauma or intergenerational trauma is just trauma that passed on from generation to generation. So there's 4 types of adaptive styles that survivors of trauma sort of get categorized into. They either become a victim, they either become numb to everything, they become a fighter, or they be classed as those who made it and they move on. So the victims are the ones that sort of find it difficult to move on. They tend to be emotionally volatile, and they tend to be very overprotective. So they're a victim, and they feel that everybody else in their following generation needs to be protected from the same type of trauma that they've been through. The ones that are numb are typically emotionally detached. So something happens and they just don't care. They're intolerant of weaknesses in others. They don't understand, like, why is it that somebody can't stand up for themselves? They like, I stood up for myself. I could numb myself off to everything else. Why can't somebody else do the same thing as they did? And then there's the fighters, who are the ones that needs to fight to survive. And you find that these are the people who would be, everything that happens to them, it becomes a fight. I'm walking down the street, somebody yells at me, and the first instinct is I want to fight this person because that person's a threat. So everything is about fighting to survive at that point. Everything they perceive easily as a threat. So they're always on the defense and they're always ready to fight and pounce on whatever it is. You get a bad grade, you're ready to fight for it. This happens, you're ready to fight. So whatever it is, that's kind of where you're at with that survival adaptive style.
You get kind of caught in fight or flight. It's that high cortisol. I mean, I was in fight or flight for 3 years, and I really, if you came against me or questioned me or, you know, tried to make me feel unbalanced, it was like this monster moved in and I would just attack you. And I'm not like that. I'm a very sweet person. I'd give you my last dollar, the shirt off my back. I give more services away than I charge. But man, you make me feel unsafe. It's like I'm a lion. I will eat your face and I won't ever apologize for doing it.
Yep.
Yep, that's
exactly
me.
That's exactly what the fighter style of survival would be.
Yeah.
And then there's the ones that just made it. They sort of move on. They find it easier to move on. Things happen. They sort of roll with the punches and they adapt and sort of overcome a little bit easier to things. It's not saying that they can't develop PTSD, but they tend to have a little bit more resiliency in terms of that. Also with intergenerational trauma, what is the message that is being passed down from generation to generation? And that is sort of like times of slavery, times of the Holocaust. What message was passed on from one generation to another generation as you get going down the line, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years down? There's something called
like the chronic cheaters, the chronic alcoholism in families, the drug addiction in families. It's just like it's passed. This is what's taught. This is what's the reality. And it just goes from one generation to the next generation until someone stands up and said, okay, the cycle is going to stop with me. And I am that person in my family. I have lost family members telling my truth, but I will tell my truth and I'm free. I'm free.
Yeah. And then sometimes you have the aspect of reparative adaptational impact. And that's where the parents tell the full story of what happened. They explain to the kids that this was a type of trauma we've been through. And the children become now overly protective of those parents. Now they feel like because they've been through so much of trauma that they're weak and there's a desire to need to protect them. And sometimes with that, it creates even trauma for those same people because you've been through trauma where you were sort of suppressed and now your kids sort of suppressing you because they feel that you need to be protected. And when it comes to that kids-parents dynamic, sometimes it's not always easy to sort of break that cycle or identify that that's what you're doing. Because sometimes you're genuinely doing it out of love. Like you love your parents and you're trying to be like, all right, I need to protect my parents. They've been through so much. But at some point in time, that love could actually become overburdening to that parent and actually cause more harm than good. So try to
it becomes toxic love, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
And speaking of toxic, let's talk about the last step where they really do kind of become the abuser themselves.
Yeah. So you have the oppressed becoming the oppressor, the abused becoming the abuser. And you see it a lot where somebody was abused as a kid, and when they become a parent, they tend to become an abuser to their kid because they don't know any different. And sometimes they don't realize that that's what they're doing because it was sort of built into that intergenerational trauma that it becomes a cycle. So generation one passes it on to generation two, that when you're an adult, you have to have control. And the only way you could have gotten control that you learned as a kid was being abusive, whether it's verbal abuse, physical abuse, even in some cases, it's the sexual abuse that you find. And at some point in time, people have to identify, I am stuck in that cycle and I need to break it. And that's where sometimes you get a little bit of a challenge that they don't recognize that that's what they're doing. It takes somebody from the outside, or sometimes they recognize it, but they don't know what to do. And that's where it's like, it's important, again, to reach out to a trained healthcare provider to get some type of help. And beyond that, there's also the idea of trauma passing through genetics down from generation to generation. So even within that, it makes it easier for you to keep that cycle. So in terms of DNA and genetics, there's the idea of epigenetics. You control the environment, you can control whether that gene is being turned on or turned off. So break the cycle, turn the gene off. And in that way, your children would not have to go through the same thing. It's less likely for them to exhibit that same gene, even though they may carry on that gene for a while, and then eventually, if nobody carries on the gene hopefully eventually sort of becomes suppressed, that it's very less likely that it ever becomes a dominant gene in that case.
Epigenetics is amazing because, you know, I've studied studies about the monarch butterfly. The monarch butterfly can actually transfer traumatic memories to their young. And that's where a lot of the monarch mind control programming can come in too. A lot of people don't understand that you can be mind controlled. There are things called monarchs, but it's a lot of just bringing people into the awareness that, look, step outside of yourself, observe yourself. And a lot of people, like narcissistic people, they don't have that capability. They cannot look outside of themselves.
And a lot of times that narcissistic personality comes from some type of trauma.
Yes.
And it could even be from just that transgenerational trauma, because as a kid, you were so suppressed that as you grow older, your only way to sort of survive is becoming a fighter. Everything, it's you, and it's only you. I have to survive. I need to do this. Whatever I have to do is I have to survive. And it's only about me at that point in time, because it was never about me when I was younger. So you find that being a sort of common trait with narcissistic personalities.
But yeah, they can't look outside themselves. Ooh, I'm getting feedback. Can you hear me okay? I'm getting tons of feedback. Is it okay?
I'm hearing you fine.
Okay. It's their trauma where I've learned, you know, I've researched also when you have trauma in your early life, it really stunts the development of your prefrontal cortex. And your prefrontal cortex is your executive decision making. Yep. So if you have stunted, and trauma literally shrinks that gray matter, they don't have the ability to think logically. They're stuck in trauma going, I got to survive. And these people don't know how to love. They, honest to God, can't love you. They don't know how.
Yeah. And it's a lot of retraining. You have to sort of retrain, but they have to be ready to sort of break that cycle. They have to be ready to come out of it. And that's the hardest thing, is bringing them towards that awareness, having them recognize where they fall on that survivor scale, how do they actually react to other people? Because a lot of times they don't realize that's what they're doing, and it's just a protective mechanism that they've been using as a kid, and it carried on through adulthood.
Yeah, my ex was like that. They would disappear, they would shut down, no communication between us, and I was always on edge. I never know if they were coming or going. And then when they were upset, they completely shut down. I mean, you can't beg someone to open up and love you. It's either they have it, they can express it, they give you what you need. And if you're finding yourself, I want you to tell my audience, really, if you find yourself in a toxic, abusive relationship, what is your recommendation as a therapist?
So
that's a loaded question.
It's a very loaded question. There's a lot of ways that you could sort of go at it. Sometimes you have to try to bring it up with your partner. Try to help them. I mean, it goes, and it depends on how far into the relationship you are, how committed to making the relationship work, or how much you're ready to just get out of the relationship. Yeah. And sometimes you have to get out, sometimes you have to stay in. Working on boundaries, identifying your personal boundaries and your personal space, and sort of setting them as your protective mechanism would be important. Whether that boundary means that you completely break off the relationship, or you sort of try to still work on it, but you set that boundary and you create that space that if you feel at any point in time you're becoming overburdened, you step away from it. Seeking out professional help, regardless of how it is and who it is. You have to let somebody else know what you're going through. Don't try to do it on your own, because a lot of times you try to do it on your own and you end up digging a deeper hole that makes it a little bit more difficult to come out longer. So earlier you're able to sort of tell other people and help, offer help to the person. You have to, if you genuinely care about keeping the relationship, you want to talk to that person. You want to be open with that person and tell them this is how you feel. And again, it goes back to how comfortable that person is with taking that feedback. How would they react to it? And how strong do you feel about taking that approach to doing it? Whether it's you go all out at once and you spill all the beans of how you feel about everything, or you give subtle hints, or you make subtle pushes. So again, it goes sort of like from person to person how you would deal with it. But again, the key to it is talking about it, bringing it up with that person, bringing it up with some type of healthcare provider so you could deal with it on the side. And if there's that possibility of both parties wanting to work together and doing some type of counseling session together, it's probably the best option there.
Yes. And my advice when I talk to my clients that I work with, if you're truly being physically, spiritually, emotionally abused on a consistent basis, there is a time where you have to love yourself more and you just got to leave. You have to make a plan, and you have to be careful, because with these narcissists that are manipulators and control freaks, they will physically harm you, or they'll try to take your kids or use them as pawns. So you have to have a plan. Have a plan. Yep. It's very good to have someone like Dr. Radley that can really be your advocate and sit down and pinpoint, like, look, this is not healthy. This is not a great boundary. You know, there's no respect here. These are things that he can help you walk through. So let's talk about some of the post-traumatic stress disorders, and what's the difference between simple and complex post-traumatic stress?
So simple deals with one or few traumas. Complex is more of multiple traumas, kind of like that complex trauma that we talked about in the beginning, where it's been multiple different traumas over a longer period of time. A lot of the symptoms are sort of similar in terms of flashbacks, avoidance, hypervigilance, nightmares, insomnia. With simple PTSD, you tend to get some difficulty with emotion regulation, in terms of like you don't feel comfortable expressing certain emotions, or you suppress certain emotions, but it's on a smaller scale compared to complex, where it's more distinct. It's easier for you to lash out. It's easier for you to express anger, uncontrolled anger in that case. Not so much of expressing it because you want to express it. It's more of like an uncontrolled reaction. You tend to have more problems with nightmares, more problems with insomnia, more problems with sleep disturbances. There is an aspect of self-perception changes, so you sort of think of yourself more negatively. You do have some degree of it with simple PTSD, but you tend to find an exacerbated aspect of it with the complex. And same thing with distorted perceptions. You don't always perceive things as they are. You sort of everything becomes a protective mechanism at that point in time. So you perceive certain things in such a way that you could protect yourself from the outside world in that case.
Yeah, I look at everybody. When I meet people, I'm like, what do you want? Where are you coming from? And what's your agenda? I mean, that's the filter that I look through, and I'm trying to change that. But it's literally everybody that's coming to my life. I'm like, they have been sick or hurt me or traumatized. And I don't want to shut down, because I do want love and I want to give love to other people. But it's really the chronic insomnia that I had when I realized, look, you've got complex post-traumatic stress. And then just the emotional dysregulation, like the littlest things would just set me off. And I'm like, what is wrong with me? Why am I just lashing out? And I didn't realize it was my brain that was just so inflamed. Brain is distorted about my safety. Let's talk about brain inflammation, because I would literally walk around feeling like my brain was on fire, because it really kind of was. Let's talk about brain inflammation and post-traumatic stress.
So there's a lot of different aspects towards that brain inflammation. It's something that you do see, and that's part of why you have a lot of comorbidities or other types of conditions that you would see associated with PTSD. You would tend to see a lot more depression because of the inflammation within the brain. you tend to find more anxiety, you tend to find things like that chronic insomnia, because it's acting on different aspects or different parts of the brain that now is causing, or it's either overstimulating something or it's under production of certain things. So you find that there's that inflammation within the brain that triggers different responses to different things. So suppresses the immune system because of the inflammation. And then sometimes it's not just brain inflammation, it's a systemic inflammation. So I've had patients that have PTSD, they have a history of PTSD, and they've shown up with cases like MS. They've had cases of muscular dystrophy. They've had tons of different neurological complaints, pain, even sometimes a simple thing as a digestive issue or pain. Joint pain.
Fibromyalgia. A lot of the fibromyalgia is probably unprocessed trauma. It's when from my research, it shows like the signal P in your brain is dysregulated. You're sitting there throwing pain signals all day long, and your brain really is dysregulating.
Yep.
Not firing properly at all. So what do we do? I know there's herbal supplements. I did a ton of like fish oil, CoQ10, and turmeric trying to get my brain settled down. Did a lot of GABA and 5-HTP trying to get my neurotransmitters nice and fortified. So I tried to approach it with an herbal naturopathic. I know you're a naturopath doctor here. So we do things a little bit differently in the naturopathic world. Would you like to tell them what makes you different since you are a naturopathic doctor?
So a lot of it is trying to figure out what exactly is going on. So you could do the testing. There's a lot of neurotransmitter testing that you could do, and then you could address it from that aspect of it. You take specific herbs, you take specific nutrients that may actually help to sort of potentiate those ones that were suppressed, and then the ones that would counteract the same. So you look at testing. So that's something that you would do in addition to taking supplements. A simple thing of starting with an anti-inflammatory diet, taking out foods that your body, or you notice your body reacting to quicker, you want to take them out of the diet. Just as a start, there are in cases that you would be okay with taking medication to suppress certain symptoms that are overwhelming. But at the same time, as you have to work on different aspects of it. And you're doing things through therapy, nutrition, diet, acupuncture, any type of general relaxation, bringing awareness to yourself, any type of mind-body practices, homeopathy. There's tons of different options that I could keep throwing out here. Behavioral therapy, psychological therapy, talk therapy, written exposure therapy, all of these things. And the idea is just sort of figuring out what is triggering everything.
Well, let's talk about the biggest thing of post-traumatic stress is really knowing what a trigger is. If you could tell us what a trigger is, and then let's talk about how those triggers really cascade into you responding or reacting or having, breathing issues or wanting to run and fight an imaginary lion. So what in the world are triggers?
So basically a trigger is anything that could cause a stimulation of any of the five senses, be it one of the five senses or all five, or two or three as the case may be. But it's an event or a person, an event or something just in general that would trigger a reaction. And it brings back up a lot of that original trauma. So that's where you would get the reaction of where it's like, all right, I'm having flashbacks, I'm having nightmares, I'm having problems with sleep, and all of these other PTSD symptoms that you see. So that's basically what a trigger is. Anything that would trip off the cycle and bring everything back towards it. So there's the event that happens, and within an event, there is something about that event that would trigger something. A lot of times there was, when your first event happened, that creates sort of that trauma that your brain stores, sort of that camel that broke, the straw that broke that camel's back, in terms of which traumatic event it is. Within that, you would have reacted with some type of emotion. And a lot of times the trigger correlates with that emotion. So when time to work on identifying a trigger, it's important to identify what was the emotion like around the follow-up event. So 2020 as a whole has been a trigger for a lot of people, right? So whichever event that happened in 2020 brings up a lot of past trauma for people. So 2020 as a whole is a trigger. Within that, it brings up different emotions. So we had the cases where a lot of people came out on their protests and wants to riot and they want to fight. The reaction is the desire to fight. The emotions is that anger that sort of comes out, right? What exactly is the trigger is something within all of this that creates sort of that memory of what has happened in the past. So I'm going to use the Black Lives Matter, right, aspect of it, right, where a lot of people came out in support of Black Lives Matter to protest because of a shooting. So a police killed somebody. Many people may have had bad experiences with a police officer. So automatically that registered as a traumatic event in their brain. Now in 2020, you have all of these things happening where it re-stimulates that. And media has a big part in promoting triggers for people because they have the advantage of twisting stories to make it seem to gain more attraction to the end use, to sell the end use, right? So media as a whole acts as a trigger for a lot of people, right? They sort of potentiate that trigger and make it bigger for somebody to act out in certain cases.
And so, Facebook too. Facebook is a bad place for people with post-traumatic stress. I had to take a break because I was getting triggered daily. I was like, it's not worth me getting triggered and spending 3 hours with my heart elevated, me breathing shallow. It's just not worth it.
Yeah. And that's the thing. It's like you have to try to figure out what exactly is the trigger. Like you said, social media was becoming a trigger for you, and you identifying that, reducing the amount of time you go onto social media allowed you, I'm sure, as a person to sort of not have as much reaction.
Right.
Any overexpression of emotions, no extra reaction that you can't control.
It's amazing how politics can bring out the worst in people. Politics and religion, you mix the two, it's a perfect storm.
Yep. And 2020 had a lot of politics all around the world.
Yes, and it's still not over with. And they're trying to, the media really is thriving on the emotional aspects of trying to trigger you, trying to get that emotional engagement. So you really do have to kind of learn how to react and how to not respond. So let's talk about the difference between reacting versus responding. I'm still working on this.
So it's not that you don't want to respond. The idea is that you do want to respond and you don't want to react, right? The things that you have to ask yourself when something happens, when the event happens, are you in control or not? If you're in control, you're responding, because a response is more of a controlled reaction. A reaction is just an impulsive sort of behavior, right? So that comes to the second question: was the action deliberate or was it impulsive? So if you're responding, you think through what you're doing, rather than impulsive, where it's like there's no time for thinking. It's an instantaneous reaction.
Yeah, it's that knee-jerk reaction. Somebody piss you off and you're just like, I want to go. It's that knee-jerk.
Yep.
You can't let people knee-jerk you. You got to think, step aside, breathe. I tell my clients, when someone upsets you, excuse yourself, do a little bit of tapping, some breathing, maybe get an essential oil and lather up or smell to calm you down. You know, it's amazing. I'm going to take a little whiff while I'm here. It's amazing how much these oils can calm you down. This really has saved me a lot. I do a lot of limbic cleaning with essential oils. Do you use these at all in your practice to clean those receptor sites?
I do, to an extent. A lot of times some patients actually come with that. They have certain things that work for them. But even with PTSD, I'm also careful with smells and essential oils, because sometimes there might be some, and that's why I rather the individual figure out what type of smells they like, because sometimes something that might be relaxing to you may actually act as a trigger to somebody else. Because, for example, I'm going to use sexual abuse. If there's a certain smell that was relaxing to you, it might have been a smell that was used in a sexual abuse. So for
Right.
somebody who's experienced with sexual abuse and they have that trauma coming up, every time they have that smell and that triggers that emotion or that triggers that reaction in their brain, that this smell is familiar, but the memory that is associated with the smell is a negative one, then you have to be careful with how do you utilize it at that point in
Right.
time. So a lot of times I'm cautious about it. It's an option. I do give patients that options to use it, but I try to make sure that I let them know of if they do know that there's certain smells that they want to avoid or that has been associated with different triggers or different traumatic events in the past, it makes it easier for them to kind of figure out yes or no to certain essential oils or aromatherapy in general.
I'm a big proponent of aromatherapy. I love it, but you have to be careful. Like I had a little girl that was raped out in the wind. She couldn't sit out in the front porch and feel the wind or the sunshine, and every time she'd do it, she'd have a panic attack. And she came to me. She said, "I've been watching you. I was calling on an account." And she says, "I know that you're a Christian. I know you're not going to judge me, but I can't sit out in the wind. I have a reaction every time I do." And I said, "Take this." I had aromatherapy, I believe it's called Trauma Life. And I said, "Go home and apply a little of this under your nose and your temples and just sit there and breathe it." And she came up crying to me the next time she saw me. She went, "Oh my gosh, I can sit out in the wind now. It doesn't bother me anymore." And I went, "Oh my gosh, that's life changing." That
Yeah.
was life changing for that person.
And that's what it takes. Sometimes it's just listening to the patient and picking up on cues that they give you. A lot of times they tell it to you or they show it to you in their writing, in their drawing or whatever, that gives like little hints. And sometimes you have to dig in to get it. Sometimes it's just there for you to pick up and use it. So like you said, outside in the wind is a comfort for a lot of people. Outside in the wind in her case was an association with a traumatic event. So in her case, it's like you have to work, you have to get her to desensitize towards it, however you do it, whether you use things like emotional freedom techniques, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, talk therapy, hypnotherapy, medication, whatever it is, like you have to at some point in time sort of desensitize the memory, retrain yourself to not associate everything with that one aspect of
Right.
whatever the trigger is with a negative response.
And the last thing here, when you're talking about reacting versus responding, is just, are you aware of things? Are you aware of what you're doing? A lot of people just don't have that awareness, Dr. Radley. They don't.
They don't. And sometimes you have to bring it to them. And sometimes they are unaware that they are aware of it, if that makes any sense. But they talk about it. They would tell you, like, you know what, I don't feel comfortable doing X, Y, and Z. Or they tell you, like, I feel different when I'm around this group of people versus this group of people. Or I feel different if I'm closer to the beach versus if I'm closer to home. Or I feel strange when I walk into this specific room. Or they see a painting or they see something. Even sometimes when patients come into the office, like they would tell you, like, all right, this reminds me of something. So you're picking up on little cues like that. They know that in the back of their mind, they have that awareness subconsciously, but consciously they don't always make that connection. So sometimes you have to dig in and you help them bring that awareness to what exactly is going on, and you try to pry open. Sometimes it's prying open a can of worms, and sometimes you have to be ready to deal with it. And again, that goes back to healthcare providers' individual perspective. It's like, are you ready to open that can of worms, or are you ready to go slow with patients? So, and sometimes it goes back on patients, whether the patient themselves are ready to open that can of worms or not. But awareness is always a big thing, because once you're aware and you identify one trigger, it makes it easier for you to identify other triggers that are around you, because that just one general awareness that you take to sit down and analyze one event that happened. Most times you use the last event that happened that brought up a traumatic flashback. You use that event, you help bring awareness to everything. So you have them write everything that affect each emotion and each sense, right? What happens, what did you smell? What did you see? What did you hear? What did you taste? What did you feel, touch? you have them write or you talk about all of those things. So within that one event, and then you compare it with the initial traumatic event, the one that they identify as their big traumatic event, which one of these senses was stimulated in both. And through that, when they're able to do it for one event, they're able to do, and see the difference, then they're able to do it for multiple other events following. And that's what the awareness is. And it sort of builds on each time you do it. So awareness on event 1 brings more awareness to event 2, brings more awareness to event 3.
Right.
And then that way it makes it easier for the patient themselves.
Well, I know that since you served in the Army, you yourself have post-traumatic stress. So what is your advice from a post-traumatic stress patient yourself? And I just got the notification our other podcast is about to start. So let's talk about your advice and then how they can get a hold of you, your website or your Instagram page. So I'll let you wrap it up here.
Okay, so this advice I have here is actually from a patient that I had since I was in school. And one day she came in and she was like, because you're in the military and you do have a passion for working with PTSD, she's like, this is going to be a helpful tip for you. And she said, when you tell your story, 2 things happen. You either learn more about yourself or someone will listen and learn from it. And she told me this when I came back. Well, she told me this prior to going on deployment. And then she told me this when I came back from deployment, because my deployment was while I was in school, and I had her, she was one of my patients when I was an intern, an observer in that case, a secondary, as we call them, in school. And then she continued being my patient when I became a primary, which would have been when I came back from deployment. And because I left sort of like in the middle of a semester, it was a sort of a crazy transition for me, leaving in the middle of a semester, coming back into the middle of a semester. So that was one of her advice that she gave to me. In terms of my advice for patients specifically, I like that advice that she gave. Apart from that, I would say when you tell your story, it helps you bring awareness to yourself, but it also helps you to focus more on yourself, bring that awareness. And once you start sharing your story, like she said, a lot of people learn from it and a lot of people could use that to help. And sometimes by you bringing awareness to yourself and you identifying certain things, people could relate to it and they would be like, okay, I kind of relate to this and I think this might actually be what one of my trigger is. And I do that sometimes with patients. I share some of my story with them, a part of my story with them. And I find that when I do that, they realize, one, that I'm human and that it's okay to have traumatic events happen to you in your life. And as a result, they tend to be more comfortable with opening up. So seek out help. If you feel like you need it, seek it out. And sometimes if you don't feel like you need it and somebody's pushing you to get help, do it, because sometimes people around you would notice the differences. And that's kind of what happened with me. My professors in school, a lot of friends started noticing differences of my personality, how I changed from before I left to when I came back. And even professors with my grades, and they pulled me aside and they was like, all right, what is going on? And they was like, I think you need to get help. And that's how I started. And I mean, it goes back to comparing trauma. Like sometimes you feel like your trauma isn't anything big, or you don't, or it becomes so common to you that it's not really traumatic. And you don't identify it as being traumatic. You don't identify yourself being in a PTSD phase. And until people start pointing out to you, then you start bringing more and more awareness towards it. So once you get to that phase, it makes it easier for you. And taking that advice from people, sometimes seeking out that help is what, again, works best.
That's one thing, the reason why I think we vibe is you're a naturopath, and I know that you experienced this, so you know what I'm telling you is truth because we both experienced it together. So let's go over some of the ways they can contact you if you'd like Dr. Radley to help you with your post-traumatic stress, or as a naturopath, if you just need your health really get regulated and your organs good and balanced. Dr. Radley's a great person to reach out to. So how can they get a hold of you?
All right, so before I give the contact information, I just want to say one more thing. I said it before in terms of finding somebody who works best with you. That's a big part of dealing with PTSD. Not because you go to one person and you didn't find like you get enough help. Don't give up on saying that you can be helped, because you could be helped. It's just finding that right person to work with you. So if I'm not that right person, there's tons of other people around. If tons of other people are not the right person, I'm here for you. So my contact information, my email is universal3hc@gmail.com, universaltree@gmail.com. My Twitter is Radley Ramdhan, and on Facebook and Instagram, both of my pages are Universal Tree Health Clinic. So those are some of the ways that you could contact me. I do virtual consults as well. So just shoot me an email or message on Instagram or Facebook, and I could follow up with you from there. And if you'd like to schedule an appointment, we could do through virtual, if not in person.
And I highly recommend Dr. Radley. Hopefully in the future, I'll be saving up. We can work together. And you're welcome here anytime. We're about to teach right now. We've got maybe 1 minute till we start a podcast on acupuncture. I can't wait to share that with y'all. If you like programs like Eden's Living TV, trying to bring a naturopathic approach, trying to teach you holistic ways to heal the mind, body, and soul, maybe think about doing a donation to Cash App, $ Eden's Living, so we can continue to bring the truths about mind, body, and soul healing. Y'all have a great night. Thank you again, Dr. Radley. We appreciate you, and you're welcome here anytime.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me.
All right. Bye-bye.